This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Teresa Krasny, director and editor of the forthcoming Degas Catalogue Raisonné of paintings and works on paper, as well as chair of the International Catalogue Raisonné Association. Teresa provides a wonderful overview of the Catalogue Raisonné process, while also sharing the challenges faced by researchers that are compiling the official record of an artist's work. In addition, she provides practical advice for living artists beginning the process in their own lifetime. And now, a conversation all about the Catalogue Raisonné with Teresa Krasny. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Teresa, you are the director and editor of the forthcoming Degas Catalogue Raisonné of paintings and works on paper. You're also a curator to a private collector, and you serve as chair of the International Catalogue Raisonné Association. And so I wanted to speak with you to talk all about Catalogue Raisonnés because I'm not sure my listeners know everything that perhaps they need to know or should know about Catalogue Raisonnés. And so for those that might not be familiar with the term Catalogue Raisonné, how do you begin to describe the work that you do?
I suppose I would first define the Catalogue Raisonné as, in English, I suppose, we would call it a reasoned catalogue. So it should be the most complete, as is possible, compendium of an artist's output over the artist's lifetime. And so this then becomes a tool for researchers, for art historians, for museum curators, for collectors, for the art market to look more closely, understand better an artist's trajectory, how they have evolved over their lifetimes, the materials that they used, the techniques they used. There's a lot that can be gleaned from a very well put together, very rigorous exploration of an artist's work in a Catalogue Raisonné. And every artist is not the subject of a Catalogue Raisonné, I hasten to add. In my opinion, they should be. I think it's a very important part of their legacy, which is a very loaded term I'm aware of. But this is something that artists can be very much involved in their own lifetimes. One great example of that, of course, is Picasso. So in 1923, he met Christian Zervos, who was the editor of Cahiers d'Art, and they got along well together. I think Zervos knew that Picasso wanted to do a Catalogue Raisonné. And bear in mind, at this point, Picasso is around 42 years old. He's very clear that he is a very significant artist of the 20th century. That is not a doubt in his mind. And he is very clear that there will be a legacy after his passing and that he will control it as closely as he possibly can. And so over the next 46 years, 33 volumes of 16,000 paintings, works on paper, and sculptures are published. And so this is one of probably the most extraordinary collaborations of the 20th century, in a way. The approach that they used may not necessarily be one that's used today, but it's one whereby, they used black and white photography, for example. I think Picasso felt that these black and white images were actually more accurate than a bad color reproduction. Given the technology and everything that's available to us today, we may disagree with that approach. The volumes themselves, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're quite monumental. They're quite large. Mm-hmm. And you turn over each page and it's just full of black and white photographs, not much text. So you can really follow the trajectory. And, he was quite meticulous in dating and even putting Roman numerals on works that he did in the same day, so you could even follow his practice in one day. And to the researcher, to the museum curator, to the auction house specialist, something of this nature is absolutely fundamental and is the first point of call if you are about to organize an exhibition on the artist, or if you have someone who comes to you and they tell you that they have an authentic work by Picasso. It certainly would be the first place that you would start. That's probably a very long-winded answer.
No,
to the question.
There are never any long-winded answers on this program. I personally just crave details. And so let me ask you, are there some common misconceptions about catalogue raisonnés? If so, what might they be?
I think that's quite a good question. I think if something purports to be a catalogue raisonné, it may just by virtue of that title kind of convey the notion that this is an extremely authoritative repository of information. However, not all catalogue raisonnés are created equally. And so there are some excellent ones and there are some that are less good. So that would be one thing to note. I think up until quite recently, the way to produce these catalogue raisonnés has been very much print and hard copy that you would find in a bookstore or a library. I think now there's much more of a move towards digitization and producing these online, which allows them to be much more dynamic creations. Perhaps there's a misconception in terms of how it should be presented, what kind of information should be conveyed. You may have separate approaches if the artist worked in many different media. So, because the medium might determine different elements that are appropriate to add that are not appropriate for add if, it's a sculpture versus a painting, for example. And maybe if the misconception is more around a lack of knowledge around the importance of them, maybe that's one of the issues, actually, is that these are such vital parts of the art world and the reason why we remember certain artists more than others, actually. So I don't think it's something that you just want to push to one side and not think about if you're a practicing artist. I think it is very much worth it to consider it in your lifetime when you have more control over who might be the one to edit your catalogue raisonné.
Well, I think one of the tricky things there is that early in an artist's career, there's so much concentration on surviving and gaining a foothold, but it's only in that mid to late career when the artist really starts concentrating on what that legacy is going to be. And at that point, it might be difficult to go back and find receipts and journal entries and things that may have been disposed of when, when you think about a lot of artists, especially in some place like New York, they may move studios annually because of gentrification, right? And things get lost in the mix.
Oh, absolutely. There are catalogue raisonnés that have been put together many, many years. For example, the Rothko catalogue raisonné that David Anfam worked on, that was made, I don't know, like 30 years after he died. And there was very little to work with. So absolutely, I take your point. And, I don't think it's necessarily vital that every single receipt, every single, bus ticket, every single thing is preserved. It might be useful and it could be useful, but some artists just aren't pack rats in the same way. And so at the very minimum, ideally, if there's someone else in the studio who could just record the works, which I think is generally something that happens in the studio anyway. I think the works are photographed front and back before they leave. There's some information about the medium, the dimensions, any inscriptions. This kind of information, even just that, is already hugely helpful. And that can form the basis of more of a kind of a laundry list approach to a catalogue raisonné. But already that would be terrific.
Well, I was listening to a webinar the other day that was held by the Catalogue Raisonné Scholars Association, and they had a conservator as a guest, and it was very clear that that conservator really craved information about the materials. She made it clear that every time she saw a photo inside the studio, she is zooming in as much as possible to figure out exactly what brand of paint, what pigment was being used, because some of those have peculiarities and problems in restoration that others don't. Again, it's hard to imagine that an artist would take the time to record imagery of what paints were used in a particular painting, but it can't be lost that the more information, the better, 100 years from now.
Completely. Yeah. And I don't think it's that complicated to really record that information. I mean, somebody could just take a photograph of the studio every month and just look at the materials that are lying around or carefully stored away. We know, for example, if we look back in time, and we can tell from letters that Van Gogh wrote, where he's describing a painting that he made, that he used the color purple in irises. Okay. But when we look at it today, we don't see purple, we see blue.
Right.
And so this gives us information around the fact that he used red pigments that tended to degrade and destabilize over time. Every piece of information that you can pull together from an artist's work studio life can help inform and build a picture in the absence of the artist being there to talk to you and to tell you. What is quite exciting is when you have a number of artists who all worked at the same time, and if you have great catalogue raisonnés for them all, you can really do a lot to understand what was happening in that milieu at the time. You can see, for example, a lot of the artists, and this goes for every generation and every movement, they often supported each other and they were the first owners of record of some of the artists' works. And so, you can read a lot into that, and you might be able to see, for example, there's a Vuillard painting, which has a Cézanne in it. So it's the interior of an art dealer's home, right, and there's a Cézanne in it. And so there are kind of clues everywhere you look if you can put together these quite dynamic chronological catalogue raisonnés. But of course, we all go into these complete rabbit holes looking for all of the information that the object gives us. So front, back, will have labels that you discern, that you have to develop a kind of a library of labels so that you understand that label is that gallery. Then you go into the archives. So in my field, there are archives such as the Durand-Well archives, which will be vitally important, which are just extraordinary in terms of they still have the stock books, they've got letters that were exchanged. And so there's a lot that we can learn in addition to what we already know. So I think that in a way was what drove me in thinking that it was time to take another look at this artist, because the Catalogue Raisonné was published in 1946. And there was a supplement that was made in reasonably slim supplement that was produced in 1984. And so when you think about all of the knowledge that has been gained over that intervening period of time on all of the connoisseurship, also all of the work that's been done on understanding the medium so much better, because he was such an innovative artist, we can get closer to understanding how he was innovative. And, I just felt that all of this information was going and sitting in little pockets, but it wasn't all coming together to be centralized in one central place. And that was depriving, I felt, the next generation curator, art historian, and frankly, a museum-going public of the benefit of knowing his work better and preserving it for longer.
You mentioned supplements there. I think that raises a good question about how catalogue raisonnés are changing. The move from the strictly published book on a shelf versus how technology is changing this type of publication. It's my understanding that in the art market, sometimes works may come up and, the house says, well, this isn't in the Catalogue Raisonné, but it's in a forthcoming supplement. And it may or may not be the case. There may not be a supplement planned, but in this changing world, we're getting to a place where Catalogue Raisonnés can be more of a dynamic living entity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think digitization allows that to happen. It doesn't speed up the process dramatically. I think if you're starting from ground zero, it's still quite a long time in terms of the production of it. So for the project that I'm working on, I imagine it will take something like 5 to 10 years. So you have to take a deep breath before you embark on something like that. But yes, I think there's an ability, because you can, if you are at a certain point and then more works come to light, then you can, upload that to the public when it's ready. So you don't have to print a whole new batch of, volumes, So it is a much more dynamic object in every way. It allows you to filter. It allows you to filter in a very exciting way. So you can filter, if you take a look at the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné, which is online, which is wonderful. I encourage all of your listeners to go and take a look at it. But there you can, filter according to owner. So you can see all of the Cézannes that Monet owned, for example. Or you can quickly take a look at, Cézanne's first solo show, everything that was shown in that first show at Vollard. Or you can even take a look at the most recent show at MoMA and see all of the works if you were unable to travel. And so it really allows you to do so much more than, not that I'm against print, because I love print. I'm quite old-fashioned in that respect. But I do think that that these dynamic this is very much the way forward, and it is very dynamic, and it's also more widely available. I think Catalogue Raisonnés to buy, print publication to buy, are they're quite expensive. They take up a lot of room on your shelf, and you might just consult them in a library. Whereas, obviously you can access the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné from your iPhone. So for that reason, I think it really is an incredible new kind of technological breakthrough almost for the field.
How does a project commonly start? Because I imagine somebody with a vested interest must be willing to cover the costs.
I think raising funds is probably one of the hardest parts. I think it very much depends on what the situation is. So if it's a living artist, or if it's an estate or foundation, there may be ways and means to raise funds. I think if it's an artist who has long passed, then you're really relying on kind of philanthropic impulses of those who understand the artist and who understand the reason why something like this is important. And that can be foundations, that can be educational foundations, collectors. It can also be the art world at large. But it's not easy, and it is expensive. It really is, And I think also, as I mentioned, these take a long time to do and to put together. And they're not necessarily something that you see an immediate net benefit from financially, certainly. That's not why one would do it at all. So the work that, I will do on this Catalogue Raisonné, I have set up a nonprofit. The Catalogue Raisonné will be available to all free of charge, as the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné is. And so these are not money-making, ventures by any stretch of the imagination. And so, we do need more in the art world who are conscious of their importance. But I certainly would recommend that if you are an artist working today, that you think about your Catalogue Raisonné, but you don't have to overthink it. I think overthinking it can make you almost paralyzed and not want to jump in. I think maybe you reach a certain point in your career, and let's say, you've worked very closely with a curator who knows your work very well, that could be the perfect fit. So I'm thinking of, Rachel White-Reed and Anne Gallagher. That person is very intimate with the works anyway, has worked extensively with the artist, and so knows enough to know when to disturb the artist, when not to disturb the artist, when to work with the studio assistant, etc. And so it can be a little bit like the Zervos-Picasso relationship. It can be a very precious relationship, which can lead to a lot, and we discover new routes of research when we start to really drill down into each individual work. So yes, but in brief, funding is always a challenge, and that's probably the number one question that I get asked.
The audience for Catalogue Raisonnés were originally art historians and people studying these artists. And over the years, they became also a tool for people in the art market to kind of point to for authentication. And I guess, at this point, do those two disparate audiences ever pull a project in different directions? Does that create conflict, or are they all looking for the same thing? Is the person that works in the art market just really concerned with whether or not a particular work is listed and it is as it presents itself versus the art historian? Just because these are two different audiences, do they present different wants and needs?
I think it's important to know your audience, obviously, when you're doing the Catalogue Raisonné. But I think more in terms of if you decide, or if you're doing a Catalogue Raisonné of sculpture, understand the needs of an audience who's looking at a Catalogue Raisonné on sculpture. Will they need to see a photograph of every cast of that edition, for example? What will they need? So that kind of doesn't really matter who specifically is reading it. It's what is expected from a Catalogue Raisonné. So at the very minimum, what is expected? I think that's very important to keep in mind. So, a photograph, of course, is expected. Then you have the basic cataloging. So you might have the title, any inscriptions, signatures, dates, locations, front, back, the medium, the dimensions, and then you have the provenance, and you have the exhibition history, and you have the literature. This, broadly speaking, is what one would expect to find in a Catalogue Raisonné. So this allows you to track the life of a single work of art, and all of the information covered will kind of, it's all sort of symbiotic. It will all feed. For example, if we know that the work, was owned by a certain date, and there's some question over the chronology of the work or the dating of the work, well, then we know, okay, well, it must have been created before that date, or if it appeared in, an exhibition history or an exhibition, and it's quite secure. And so basically, you want as forensic and as rigorously researched an entry as is possible. Now, if you are a print collector, you might expect more information around the condition of the piece, rather than if you are, somebody who collects paintings and won't necessarily expect to find that information. But each different Catalogue Raisonné, well, by its nature, is a little bit different, and some do include quite a bit of information about condition as they knew it. So if a work was damaged, they might include that. If a work was cut into or was cut down, or that sort of information can be provided. Or if there are biographical details that become relevant, then that can be added. That's really at the discretion of the editor. So I don't know that. I think you need to be conscious that there is an informed audience consulting this. And I think you need to aim at your most demanding member of the audience in terms of the rigor that you apply in putting this together.
It just sounds like the catalogs Raisonné just take on so many different shapes and sizes that each one is a little bit different. I mean, is there ever any discussion about creating some sort of standards? I mean, a group like ICRA having particular standards that they could wind up certifying a particular catalog Raisonné as meeting certain standards?
Yeah, I think I think that's an interesting thing to try and put across. I mean, as I've described to you, broadly speaking, that's what you would cover. But again, depending on the medium, it might be slightly different or the period that the artist was working through. So what would be interesting, I think, would be to take that information, because when we talk about catalog resonance, we're not just talking about, the 20th century, we're talking about art history, and we're talking about major artists, and we're talking about minor artists. And so it's relevant and applicable to all. But yes, I do think that there is place, and that's part of our mission really, is to uphold standards and to promote the importance and the significance of the Catalogue Raisonné, but also, be a resource for those who are starting out to kind of give guidance on what the standards should be. And I think, some of the Catalogue Raisonné softwares actually, because of their nature and how they're structured, they do sort of force a certain standard, because there are certain boxes that you have to fill. And over and above that, you can add in scans of the underlying resources when possible. You can also add in, as the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné did, you can add in historical archival material like postcards or photographs that kind of bring more to it. So they're more the sort of bells and whistles. But I think as archives and this information becomes more and more broadly digitized, that we have access to that, so we can make these much richer. So I would say that the standards have really evolved just because what we can do has really, really changed for the better.
If you were to point to one project that maybe really got it right, is the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné, or is there another one that you look at and say, this really is well done?
I think that's a really good question. And if I were embarking on a Catalogue Raisonné project, I would pose that question. And I would look across all of the Catalogue Raisonnés that have been made and look at those particularly related to the area that I'm involved in. And then look at kind of the best practices in and amongst that group. And then I would align myself with that, and I would get in touch with those authors I find. And through ICRA, we've created this fabulous network of art historians and editors of Catalogue Raisonnés and artist liaisons and artists and their families. And really, that's a great network to raise your hand and say, look, I'm thinking about this. I'm not quite sure how to do it. Or I really like this. How difficult was that to do? And so while I've been obviously mentioning the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné project, it's because for me, that was a very close comparable in terms of, the period that the artist is working in and what they have been able to do. But that doesn't mean that it's going to work for every project. Every artist is different. We understand that. And so I think if you're embarking on this, I would really recommend taking a look at as many Catalogue Raisonnés, and there's some excellent Catalogue Raisonnés, and to really look at what they've done and how they did it and how long it took them and what it might have cost and what size of team they used and what resources they used, what archival material they used, and don't feel that you are doing this on your own. I think often, because it is quite a solitary engagement, that you can feel that you are very much on your own. But there are many, many who are in the same boat, who are asking themselves the same questions. And I think that is the beauty of organizations like ICRA, in that can give you that sense of a community that's very heavily involved in the area that you are, and can really help push you along. When you start at the outset, it can be very overwhelming.
Maybe you could give us a little bit more finite detail in relation to the project you're currently in. Like, How large is your team? Is it just you, or do you have people supporting you? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? Like, is it photographing, or what are you in the middle of right now that's kind of causing you to pull your hair out?
It's funny, in advance of this call, I pulled up my notebook where, I wrote down, I think it was like the 7th of the 3rd, 2021, day one. So I've been looking back at just, what I was thinking then and what I'm thinking now and how much has changed and evolved in that period of time. And I think, definitely at the beginning, there's so many questions in your mind that you actually have to just start doing it is a very key component. Obviously, it might sound really banal and obvious, but you just really have to start. I set up a nonprofit company, and I hired a PhD graduate, Danielle Smith. So she is the cataloger, and I've recently just hired a research assistant on a part-time basis to supplement what she's doing. Um, you know, Obviously part of the role is to really also reach out to archives. It is so detail oriented, and there's a point where you don't know where to stop actually, because you can just keep going and going and going and going. I think when you take the long view, I mean, we're only a few years into this, so when you take a long view, okay, well, here is the provenance as it stands now for this particular work, but I know when I catalog the next one, I will run into that again, and I will find something new, and I will find something else, and I will be able to supplement it further. So there are some calls eventually that you have to make in knowing, okay, now it's time to draw a line under it. But there's so many interesting challenges. One being, right, we know what works are in museums. We know what works have passed through the auction houses. We know some of the works that have passed through galleries, but all of the works that have been lying dormant in private collections and have not come out for a very, very long time, therein lies a huge challenge. I remember way back when I was at Christie's, if somebody was doing a catalogue raisonné, they would put an insert into the catalogs that we shipped to all the clients around the world. And so that was getting the word out to the relevant people, and that could trigger those to get in touch. Obviously, there aren't catalogs like that anymore. And so there have to be other ways to be able to reach these collectors. But there are lots of sort of interesting issues that you hit as you go. But again, if you have a good network around you that you can tap into, that you can take advice from in terms of, okay, how did you deal with this? What was your next step? And in addition to that, I have this, terrific, committee that's an advisory committee, which is really made up of like the eminence grise in the world of Degas. And that's an excellent resource. So you just kind of, try to keep everything together, and you just keep on track. And I think it's really important to have goals and regular goals over time, even if some, as they get closer, you understand that they may or may not be achievable. I think it gives structure and order to the process, because without that, it's too large to kind of really understand the whole thing. And also, even just from a financing point of view, you need to have structure and goals. But it's also a joy. I don't think we do this just because. We do it because it allows us to go so much deeper into understanding a given artist. And that's extremely exciting.
What do you feel is on the horizon? I mean, will technology continue to evolve? Will technology make it easier for artists to archive earlier in their careers? What do you see? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Technology is going to make it much easier. I think the one thing is, as I've mentioned, these are long-term projects. So you need to be quite sure that the technology that you're working with today is viable in 5 years and 10 years' time. And I think that's really important to note. I think you also have to stay very much abreast of other resources that are being digitized, and so that you don't have any blind spots in terms of your research mandate. I think in terms of artists and their studios, I think, just being able to maintain an archive, which is, the raw materials of their own catalog raisonné, I think should be pretty straightforward. I think that there are, quite simple databases that are quite easy to put together. So I think it's a positive thing. I don't know if you're going to bring the whole blockchain thing into it at this point.
What do you think about utilizing the blockchain to help?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting idea, and I just spent a weekend with quite a few digital artists or people who are working in this space, and I think they're quite excited about the possibility. I think from my perspective, the information is only really as good as the person who's input the data and the accuracy of the underlying data once it's been input. So I think that's kind of, in the end, it comes back down to that. So unclear at this point, I would say.
I guess that points to there needing to be a certain amount of gatekeeping as to who's controlling that, what is considered certifiable data there, right?
That's true. I think that's right. I mean, you want, like, there's a trained team here working on this particular project. So at what point do you let go and allow the information to be input by another party, if that would be required?
Yeah, and that begins to feel a bit like an authentication committee. That seems like a parallel in totally different world. Do those worlds cross over much, where the Catalogue Raisonné people and the authentication people, are they parallel, or are they sometimes the same people? Or
it makes sense, and with everything there's no hard and fast rule. Sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're in parallel, or quite separate, or there isn't a Catalogue Raisonné but there is an authentication committee, or there is a Catalogue Raisonné but there's no authentication committee. So each artist has its own authentication ecosystem, I would say, and each one is a little bit different.
Well, that sounds like fun.
It's a ton of fun. Navigating that is really quite something.
Teresa, I know that you were the chair of ICRA, the International Catalogue Raisonné Association. What kind of programming or resources does that association provide? What sort of benefits can people enjoy by being involved with that association?
There's a ready-made network of peers, which is wonderful to tap into. In addition to that, we have, regular events. So far, we've held them in London, and we've had one recently in New York. They're really, there might be an artist studio visit or a visit to an exhibition. But our main annual event is the annual conference, which typically takes place at the beginning of December. This will be the fifth one this year, which is quite exciting. The first one we did was live and in person, and it was really just about Catalogue Raisonné's 101. What is it? Who reads it? Why should you do one? And then we did one on provenance. We devoted an entire day to provenance. And then we did one on sculpture. So the provenance one and the sculpture one both took place online because they took place during COVID. And that really drove our membership. So we now have about 200 members in 21 countries, which is pretty exciting. And last year we did it on legacy in person, and that was excellent. So we had artists, grandchildren speak. We had artists' children speak about the legacy. I was so interested to listen to your recent conversation with Flavin Judd, actually, and that whole concept of as the child being in the art world by accident, and what you have to deal with as a consequence. I thought that was really fascinating. But we also had Michael Craig Martin, Rachel White-Reed, we had Marina Abramovich, Edmund Deval, so it was really quite a fabulous lineup. And then this year, it will be on the 5th of December, and it will take place at the Royal Academy, and the topic is on paper. And it coincides with the Royal Academy's exhibition, Impressionists on Paper. and we will have a fabulous program. So watch this space. And we'll start selling tickets, I would imagine, in October, November. But I'm very excited about that. So we're working on that right now.
Teresa, I really appreciate your time today. And I really appreciate you being willing to be patient with all my questions to try to illuminate this subject that I'm not sure everyone understands clearly, but I think hopefully everyone does a little bit more now. And I wish you the best of luck on your enormous project. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much, Craig. It was a real pleasure.
Awesome. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.